When you do think about it at all, most people think, well, it's a way of limiting the power of the state, right? Like the idea is human beings have human rights, the right to freedom of expression or freedom of association or the right not to be tortured or something like that. And those things kind of form hurdles or barriers to state power. That's kind of like the cliche about what human rights are for. But if you see it the way human rights work, or how human rights work in practice, you get a very, very different image of what human rights law is doing. What human rights law seems to be doing is opening up society to intervention by the state in the name of securing often a vision of equality, combined sometimes quite paradoxically with an ideal of freedom. It's as though human rights law is designed to force the state to render everybody equal and also free. So it's as though human rights law's aim, rather, is to kind of facilitate the scope of state power. And so to give you an interesting example of that, you can't have failed to notice that at the time of the first lockdown, the big original COVID lockdown of March 2020, nobody was talking about the classic ideal of human rights law as restraining state power. Nobody was saying, well, hang on, what about the right to freedom of association? Shouldn't people be allowed to meet each other unrestrained by the strictures of the state? What about the right to liberty? Shouldn't people be able to go where they choose? Shouldn't they be free to do that? Nobody was talking about freedom of conscience. I, for example, don't believe that masks are particularly useful in restricting the spread of respiratory viruses. So shouldn't I be able to express my freedom of conscience in refusing to wear a mask? That kind of a way of thinking about human rights was totally absent, as you will no doubt remember. Instead, if we heard about human rights at all, what we heard was, well, the right to life needs to be protected, right? So the state needs to ensure that people's right to life is secured, so they're protected from the harm of the virus. By extension, of course, people's right to health ought to be protected, so they ought to be insulated from the spread of COVID. And also non-discrimination, you might remember, or equality. You might remember that a big kind of a discourse at the time of the first lockdown surrounded this idea that COVID has this kind of discriminatory effect. So there's this idea that what the state ought to be doing is keeping people alive, protecting people from becoming sick, and also making sure that the virus affected everybody equally. So that is not a recipe for a small state. So you can see that human rights, in the way it's understood in the contemporary sphere, has very little to do with our kind of classical liberal understanding of what human rights is, that it's a restriction on state power.